Welcome to our 7th webinar, Politics of Literature. As always, my gratitude goes to İpek Cem Taha, the director of the Columbia Center in Istanbul, Merve Tezcanlı İspahani, academic programs coordinator, and Seden Gürlek, program officer, as well as to James Leitner, whose generous sponsorship is much appreciated. I thank our participants, Ingeborg Foosestøl, Erik Blackthorne-O'Barr, and Hazal Halavut for working closely with us and for opening up new perspectives on cross-disciplinary fields of inquiry as they integrate literature into political, cultural, and even urban history. We are grateful to Professor Nergis Dolcerocca, who kindly accepted to be our discussant and generously contributed to the intellectual rigor of our panel. Last time we covered a long time bracket from the 1720s to the 1910s, examining the shifting uses of soft power. Now we're dealing with only 26 years, from 1883 to 1909. This narrow chronological frame allows us to look closely at the publishing scene of the Hamilian period, as well as the transition to the CUP regime. Periodicals in competition and in collaboration with each other play major parts and feature an international popular genre, the serial, the tefrika. As we will see in all the three papers, translations and original Turkish novels thrive on this medium. It would indeed be fair to claim that almost all of the Turkish novels of the time, from Halit Ziya's Aşk-ı Memnu 1889 in Servet-i Fünun to Reşat Nuri's Çalıkuşu 1922 in Vakit, were serialized. The serial fad went beyond literature, extending to articles on science and technology. Consider, for example, that the construction of the Hijaz Railroad was covered in several issues of Servet-i Fünun, the reports and commentaries supplemented with maps and photographs. Of course, the reading public played a key role in the success of the genre, exploding in numbers and making and breaking deals. Educational reforms were instrumental in this, as well as the changing reading habits. Tanpınar reminds us not to underestimate the new home tradition of one family member reading aloud to the whole family in the evenings. All it took was one schoolboy or one schoolgirl. Our previous webinar's main theme was Ottomans and their others. We re-entered the same field from a very different angle. Who are the others now? In Ingeborg's paper, they are the French writers. We may even push the category to the ambiguous area of classics. Erik's are Iranians, Ajemler, on the margins of Istanbul's daily life. Hazal's Armenians, hitherto seamless members of the Ottoman society, turned into others at the turn of the new century. We extend our list of primary sources to include novels translated from French and written in Turkish, editorials, and public correspondence, all from the pages of periodicals. Before introducing our speakers and our discussant, let me announce a change in our schedule. We will not hold the webinar in August. This is to accommodate everybody's vacation plans. We will return in mid-September with a very interesting session on gender and domestic interiors, followed in October by another compelling webinar on the politics of archaeology, our second on this topic. We have many more exciting meetings lined up for the next academic year. Now, our speakers. Erik Blackthorne-O'Barr is a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University, currently focusing on Ottoman depictions of Iran and sanitary discourse during the 19th century. He received an MA degree in Turkish Studies from Sabancı University and a BA from the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations at the University of Toronto. Erik is the recipient of the 2020 Sidney Fisher Graduate Student Prize given by the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. Ingeborg Foosestøl is a PhD candidate in the History Department at the University of Oslo. She specializes in late Ottoman intellectual history with a focus on reading publics, multilingualism, and the connections between literature, theory, and the press. Foosestøl has studied at the University of Oslo, Boğaziçi University, and Université de Montréal. She translated novels by Orhan Pamuk, Burhan Sönmez, and Aslı Erdoğan into Norwegian. Hazal Halavut is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto's Women and Gender Studies Institute. Her research focuses on the collective trauma, memory, the aesthetics of mourning, and the literary representations of the Armenian genocide. She lectured and published on state violence and collective memory in Turkey, specifically on the 1980 military coup, sexual violence under custody, and women's resistance practices. She's a writer and co-editor for the online feminist journal Beş Harfliler. Our discussant, Nergis Dolcerocca, is an associate professor of comparative literature at Koç University. She received her doctoral degree in comparative literature from NYU in 2016. Her work focuses on comparative modernisms, narrative theory, literature of the Near East, critical theory, and digital humanities. She is the author of Self and Desire in Modern Turkish Novel and the guest editor of the special issue of the Journal of Middle Eastern Literatures entitled Beyond Literature, Reading Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar Today. Professor Dolcerocca received the 2020 European Research Council starting grant for her project titled Modernizing Empires, Enlightenment, Nationalist Vanguards, and Non-Western Literary Modernities. Thank you all very much, and now let's pass the torch on to Erik.
Wow, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen here. I have a little map. Let me try here. Okay, can everyone see the map? It's a very obvious map, but sometimes it's nice to have a sense of place. Okay, let me start. So when we first encountered the figure of Acem Ali Bey in the early pages of Ahmet Mithat Efendi's 1882 novel, rdane Hanım, he's already presented to us as a series of apparent contradictions. He haunts Istanbul's impoverished port districts of Tophane and Lower Galata, where pickpockets and street gangs think nothing of, quote, the cruel murder of men, but is himself chivalrous and a spendthrift of evident social status. He is supposedly Persian, but his features are described as Arab, and his outfit wholly European. Only, quote, the light, striking Persian accent in his speech betrays his Iranian origin. The ending of the first chapter, however, reveals the most crucial contradiction. For as Ahmet Mithat explains, quote, the hero called Acem Ali Bey is really a delicate young girl named Ulviye Hanım, who has adopted the guise of a young Persian boy to perform feats of altruism throughout the city. Before this is revealed, however, Acem Ali Bey is depicted as a fraught object of desire for the inhabitants of the neighborhood, and as a, quote, faultless male beauty who recalls the eroticism of Ottoman divan literature. The course of the novel follows through various twists and turns the resolution of each ambiguity in favor of a normative ideal, as the alter ego is gradually dropped in Ulviye Hanım, revealed to be a young and wealthy Ottoman widow of, quote, Iranian or Indian extraction, takes up instead the respectable role of wife and adoptive mother in Istanbulite high society. So what are we to make of this character and the novel as a whole? Despite its popularity at the time, Dürdane Hanım, which first appeared serialized in Ahmet Mithat's newspaper Tercüman-ı Hakikat, has largely escaped in-depth critical attention. Tanpınar, for example, merely marked it as the first mention of the telephone in an Ottoman novel. Although there is a vast amount of excellent scholarship on Mithat's novels, his reputation as a sleazeless writing machine, alongside his self-proclaimed lack of literary artistry, has perhaps hampered analysis of those works considered to be of more minor or more popular character. Yet the narrative structure of Dürdane Hanım is actually really quite complex, and the conflation of various markers of alterity in the figure of Adem Bey is a rich source regarding the anxieties over class, desire, and gender norms which shaped Istanbulite social life during the reign of Abdülhamid II. As I argue here, Adem Bey's positioning within the city, his Persianness, his gender trouble, and dangerous eroticism were not accidental qualities but interdependent. Through the novel, Ahmet Mithat enacted Tophane and Galata as zones of particularly Persianate modes of desire, in large part based on subcultural forms then present within these districts. And yeah, indeed, so you can see on this map, we have Tophane, Galata, and then Beyoğlu up above, and down below, Validehan, which is where the main kind of Iranian community is, and Bab Ali, which is where the kind of publishing and printing district and industries were really concentrated. And in fact, Ahmet Mithat was born and educated in Tophane, and he would emphasize the poverty and destitution of his childhood in promoting his eventual image as an entrepreneur and self-made man, although after 1873 he lived instead in fashionable Beyoğlu. Upon founding Tercüman-ı Hakikat in 1878, Ahmet Mithat turned to these neighborhoods, increasingly precarious in the wake of the socio-economic crises of the 1870s, for the subject matter of his serialized novels. In works like Henüz 17 Yaşında, which came a little bit earlier, he depicted Galata and Tophane as marginal zones overrun with violent street gangs and wayward women in a desperate need of benevolent authority and guidance from above. Dürdane Hanım, if anything, heightened the contrast between Galata and wealthier areas like Beyoğlu even further, depicting the former as a crime-ridden slum where the inhabitants, quote, drink each other's blood even more predatory than wolves, and the latter as a glitzy but shallow realm of conspicuous consumption. Perhaps surprisingly, for it is rarely discussed, Iran also appears as a regular motif in his work. Through his writings, the Persian language is associated with an alluring but dangerous sensuality. In the novel Felatun Bey ile Rakım Efendi, for example, the effect of hearing it is literal intoxication. The more vernacular Ottoman Turkish of his popular novels, he argued, served to awaken his readers from a delirium induced by Persian influence. It was the Persian eroticism of the young male beloved, however, that was the primary locus of Ahmet Mithat's literary anxiety, and which animates the central tension in Dürdane Hanım. Already evident in Ahmet Kemal's writings was a certain association between this eroticism and the influence of Iran in Ottoman divan literature, exemplified by terms like Çar Ebru, referring to the incipient mustache, Dilber, Ottoman compound forms like Gulam Pare, Shahid Baz, and Mahbub Dost, and practices like Kürçek dance. For Ahmet Mithat, this eroticism became an effective language, and a repression of this desire equivalent to the banishment of these terms. His dismissal of his son-in-law, Muallim Naci, from Tercüman-ı Hakikat, for his promotion of words like Gulam, Çar Ebru, Bade, and Saki, in poetry is sort of a case in point, as are his later attacks upon the so-called Ottoman decadents for their overly Persianate vocabulary. Galata and Tophane were in large part Greek districts with sizable Muslim, Armenian, Jewish, and Levantine populations. Istanbul's Iranians, by contrast, live mostly in the historic peninsula near their center at the Validehan, and you can see it on this map here. Yet I argue that Ahmet Mithat's emplacement of Ajam Ali Bey into Galata and Tophane served instead to map this sense of a Persian eroticism and gender ambiguity onto the treacherous urban geography of these districts, inspired perhaps by the continued presence of deprecated cultural forms among their residents. As the novel notes early on, remnants of the abolished Janissary Corps evident in Galata and Tophane, such as the Tulumbucu firefighters, maintained practices like Köçek dance and open expressions of Mahbub Dostluk, despite their increasingly illicit character. At the time of Dürdane Hanım's publication, however, a considerably more direct connection was already in evidence. In the theaters and social clubs of the city's port districts, particularly the American Theater on Tophane Avenue, and you can see it on this map there, just between Tophane and Galata. And then the theater, which is explicitly mentioned in the text, a genre of musical cabaret called canto was emerging, generally performed by young Greek or Armenian actresses like Amalia and Piruz, and borrowing freely from earlier performance genres like Köçek and Çengi dance, Karagöz, and Ortoyunu improvisational theater. Yet it is most clearly in Acem Kantosu, or Iranian canto, that the play with gender performance that had characterized Köçek dance and Ortoyunu was maintained. In the costume of an Iranian youth, actresses like Piruz performed as male figures and sang love duets with more feminine coded canto singers. In other Iranian cantos, like those performed by the actress Virgin, the singer performed as a young Persian man in love with an Istanbulite canto singer of the same name, that is, in love with her own stage persona. Lastly, perhaps the most succinct connection was to be found in the name of Istanbul's most notorious brothel during the reign of Abdulaziz and onwards, that is, Acem. So Ajam Ali Bey can, in this sense, be read not just as a kind of exotic character, but as something of a kind of stand-in for a whole subculture of desire and gender performance, which was localized within the underclass neighborhoods of Istanbul, and which Ahmet Mithat's project of social reform sought to disavow and transform. It is exemplified most directly in the scenes of Dürdane Hanım, in which Ajam Ali Bey is presented as a treacherous object of desire for the upright local Cherkes Sohbet, himself once considered a mahbub, only for his attraction to be sanctioned once he discovers that Ali is Ulviye. Throughout their early encounters, Ahmet Mithat continuously uses their interactions and interplay of looks to model for his readers the difference between moral and immoral desire. Cherkes Sohbet, he declares, is not among the, quote, immoral ones who can be hated and shamed for pointing out the beauty of young men. His desirous looks towards Ajam Ali Bey, he writes, are chaste, and above all, quote, not comprised of Mahbub Dostluk. A corresponding moment occurs later in the novel, when Aisha Ebe, a woman who has fallen in love with Ajam Ali Bey and is herself dressed in men's clothes, is nevertheless defended as proper. As Ahmet Mithat reminds us, quote, she fell in love believing her a man, not a woman. At the same time, Ajam Ali Bey is continuously described using the erotic vocabulary of divan literature, and Cherkes Sohbet's looks repeatedly threaten to turn transgressive, until, overcome with desire, he looks upon Ajam Ali Bey as he sleeps and learns that this identity is mere guise. It's precisely at this point that Reşat Ekrem Koçu would later end his entry on Ajam Ali Bey in Istanbul Encyclopedia. Following this reveal, it seems, the novel lost much of its suspense, with the marriage of Ulviye Hanım and Cherkes Sohbet becoming a foregone conclusion. These scenes have been understood as reflections of Ahmet Mithat's overtly patriarchal public persona and his personal disapproval of homoeroticism. Yet considering the expressly educational and reformist purpose of Ahmet Mithat's popular novels, it is surprising that Dürdane Hanım has not been read as promulgating and enacting a discourse of normative and non-normative gender performance and desire, rather than simply reflecting an already existing state of affairs. Indeed, Ahmet Mithat's own correspondence with Muallim Naci records a struggle to match the conceptual complexity of the Ottoman language relating to desire and the practice of looking to a normative structure more aligned with the emergent language of sexuality. The framework, tentatively established by Ahmet Mithat, will later be much extended by writers like Ömer Seyfettin, who explicitly made the connection between Persianate vocabulary, the, quote, repulsive figure of the Char Ebru, and the literary, social, and psychological sicknesses which he claimed had afflicted Turkish civilization. For Seyfettin, the cure was a turn towards Istanbulite Turkish, albeit one which had been purged of those linguistic elements now deemed foreign in origin and mentality. Yet the figure of Ajam Ali Bey is, of course, a consummate deployment of the very imagery and vocabulary the author wished to disavow, and as such the character is also able to be read against its intended didactic purpose. Reşat Ekrem Koçu's entry on the character, for example, liberally edits long quotations from rdane Hanım such that most of Ahmet Mithat's moral pronouncements are absent. Koçu ends his entry somewhat ruefully, noting that Ajam Ali Bey was perhaps, quote, too extreme, a type for the era, and was thus balanced out by the conventional ending of the novel. Nevertheless, such inclusions, as the scholar Rustem Artu Altanay has written, suggest a certain continuity between the transgressive performances of his time and suppressed Ottoman forms. By this time, however, the complex Perso-Ottoman vocabulary for different modes of desire, beauty, affection, and play, which was still in evidence in rdane Hanım, had largely been made unintelligible through a program of language reform, inspired in part by the writings of Ahmet Mithat and Ömer Seyfettin. Instead, a new discourse of licit and illicit sexualities had clearly emerged in its place. Thank you. And now I'll pass it to, I believe, Ingeborg.
Thank you. In 1918, the German Orientalist Otto Hartmann wrote about the Turks that they were, quote, the translation people of the Orient, as they in recent times have become nothing but translators, unquote. Late Ottoman society was indeed a translation culture, a fact that had ripple effects that went beyond actual texts and translation strategies. This paper presents certain focal points in late Ottoman translation. First, the role of the press in the dissemination of translated texts. Second, the choice of what to translate. Third, ideas about translation and its purposes. Fourth, economic considerations and an emerging print capitalism that affected the translation practice. These focal points are all interwoven in the serial novel or the tefrika. The periodic press was the main arena for translation of fiction into Ottoman Turkish, and the 1890s represented a peak both in translated and Turkish serialization. Ali Serdar and Reyhan Tutumlu point at, quote, a drastic increase, unquote, in tefrika literature during this decade. Periodicals were thus central in disseminating the novel genre through tefrikas. The Turkish press incorporated translation in at least two ways. On the one hand, the ideas about what translation should be and which purposes it should serve, that is, educating the readers in morally purposeful ways rather than entertaining them in detrimental ways, and providing constructive examples for a developing Turkish literature. These ideas were a stark contrast to the actual translations, which mainly consisted of the works of popular authors such as Xavier de Montespan, Paul de Kock, Jules Verne, and Paul Bourget, despite the fear that they botched Ottoman habits and morals. They were immensely popular not only across communal borders within the Ottoman Empire, but also in France and in other parts of Europe, thus turning the popular serial novel into a transnational genre. On the other hand, the practical sides of translation concerned the urge to earn money and to make the reader buy yet another issue. The reader was also a consumer. The tefrika thus turned into a major player in the 19th century print economy. In the following, I will present one example of how a tefrika could serve as an attempt to fulfill several purposes. In June 1898, three major Istanbul periodicals, Tercüman-i Hakikat, İkdam, and Servet, collaborated in organizing a translation competition. All three were going to translate and serialize Alphonse de Lamartine's 1849 novel Raphael in order to select the best translation. The serialization of a 50-year-old love story stood out from the remaining serializations, mostly consisting of popular novels. It is possible to identify a tension or an interplay between the ideals propagated by leading intellectual voices and the constant need to earn enough money to make the publication function. This tension is remarkably evident in the Raphael competition. Raphael, solidly anchored in the romantic or emotionalist tradition, tells the story about Lamartine himself as a young man experiencing a brief and unhappy love affair with a certain Julie Charon. The borders between fiction and reality are blurred, and as much as a semi-autobiographical love story, the work is a lyrical exploration of a young man's experience of love. In Tercüman-i Hakikat, the classic nature of Lamartine's work was underlined in Selanikli Tevfik's, the translator's foreword. Quote, "Since a couple of years, we have felt a growing desire in our heart to translate the classical works of the West into our language," unquote. Similarly, Servet emphasized the contribution of the Raphael translation to literature. Quote, "We are not setting about translating this work in order to make our ability seen, but in order to render a service to literature," unquote. How the three publications came up with Raphael as the best work to render these services is not explained beyond statements similar to the ones just quoted. Moreover, Raphael had already been published as a book at least twice, making it available for those interested in Lamartine's work. There was, in other words, nothing inventive with the choice of Raphael. It was not even a first-time translation. This, together with Selanikli Tevfik's understanding of Raphael as a classic and Servet's emphasis of its translation as a service, bring the thought to what in the scholarship has been labeled the classics debate, Klassikler tartışması, in which a series of ideals and problems about translations were discussed. This debate was, according to Saliha Paku, kicked off in 1897 as an appeal to, quote, "the talented writers to translate the European classics," unquote. The definition of classic is, however, somewhat intangible or perhaps arbitrary. The Greek classical works are not mentioned in the contributions, but rather neoclassical and romantic works. Verse is repeatedly emphasized as more complex to both author and translate than prose. A classic seems to have represented a literary stage rather than a specific period of time. It was a work that was remembered and that would not be forgotten within 200 years, like the, quote, "corrupting stories of Émile Zola or the scandal-riven works of Paul Bourget," unquote, to use Ahmet Mithat Efendi's own description. The idea of translation from Western languages into Turkish as educational was a common theme. In other words, to teach Ottoman readers lessons about literature and ultimately to make Ottoman literature the bearer of progress and civilization, a role allegedly filled by literature in the West. I propose to place the Raphael competition and the framing of it in connection with the classics debate and even see it as an intervention to the debate. Two 1897 contributions shed light on the choice to translate Raphael and on its role in the translation landscape. First, the poet Cenab Şahabettin's statement that, quote, "there is no doubt that we have all heard the names of Corneille, Racine, Molière, Shakespeare, Schiller, and Goethe before those of Paul Bourget, the Goncourt brothers, and their likes, but in their books we find nothing of ourselves," unquote. His emphasis on identification to a certain extent clarifies the choice of Raphael. It was considered a work, quote, "suitable for mourning and weeping," unquote, as Ikdam stated, while at the same time being a valuable contribution to, quote, "our nation's bookstore," unquote, as emphasized in Servet. Such a competition thus tentatively served two purposes. It should both engage the readers who bought the periodical and contribute to the advancement of Ottoman literature. Raphael represented something less corrupted than the popular literature and perhaps more appealing or accessible than the classic one. Second, a contribution to the debate by the editor of Ikdam, Ahmet Cevdet, is noteworthy. He stated that, quote, "here the place where translation happens is first and foremost in the periodic press, and we ask, how many people are there who can fulfill such a task? How many translators are there who do not make unforgivable mistakes in either Turkish or French? The poorest of them do not even know Turkish. We are not yet in a position where we can translate the classics. We have to protect their purity until we reach such a stage, end quote. Ahmet Cevdet both recognized the press as the main provider of translated literature and humiliated the translators. Due to their lacking language knowledge, the best foreign works, the classics, simply had to wait for competent translators to enter the stage. By humiliating the translators, he also acknowledged their power as mediators of literature. The translators involved in the Raphael competition were the above-mentioned Selanikli Tevfik for Tercüman-i Hakikat, Nuri Şeyda for İktam, and a team consisting of Müstecabizade İsmet and İskender Fereri for Servet. Selanikli Tevfik was an acknowledged translator, and he had translated a total of 9 serial novels, many of them gripping popular ones. Nuri Şeyda translated 3 serial novels, including Raphael, whereas Müstecabizade İsmet and İskender Fereri only translated Raphael. Resimli Gazete declared Selanikli Tevfik the winner in advance. Quote, "The leading translator in our city is Tevfik Bey Efendi. Tevfik Bey translation of Raphael is without doubt preferable among the other Raphael translations," unquote. İktam, displeased with Resimli Gazete's predictions, felt it necessary to defend their own Nuri Şeyda. Quote, "We have witnessed in Nuri Şeyda Bey's translation a manner of expression that is perfect for translating the author's emotionality. We were deeply touched when we heard his French, and his Turkish made the same impression on us," unquote. The translators were put in the spotlight, and they got a word in themselves in a variety of introductions and comments to the translations. This celebration of the translators may be interpreted as a response to the translation debate's classical attitude towards their abilities. Tercüman-i Hakikat, İktam, and Servet turned the tefrika into a platform where a serious attempt was made to render a classical work accessible and its translators visible. There is also another aspect to the Raphael translation, namely the economic one. The tefrika format, perhaps comparable to today's TV series, was conceptualized to grab the reader's attention and to urge them to continue to buy the journal or magazine. The decision to initiate a translation competition, the framing of the competition as something the readers should follow closely, and the hyping of the translators together witness to an awareness of the exploitative nature of the tefrika. Mabadı var, or to be continued. However, the potential profit must have been limited when 3 periodicals published what ended up as 3 more or less identical translations. Moreover, the cliffhangers characteristic to such formats were absent in the Lamartine translations. Instead, the segments frequently ended in the middle of a sentence, paragraph, or chapter. They generally did not follow the original's division of chapters, and the 3 periodicals translated in different pace. Altogether, this inevitably transformed the original text. Raphael, the classic, may not have been that suitable for the commercial format of the tefrika after all. In Tercüman-i Hakikat, Xavier de Montespan's Para Kuvvetli, Sa Majesté l'Argent, even paralleled Raphael, giving the readers the choice between the classic and the popular. To cap it all, only İktam and Servet completed the translation, and the winner was never proclaimed. Immediately after the completion of the translation, however, İktam started to repeatedly publish variations of the following announcement. Raphael, published as a book, will be available from next Friday. Unquote. İktam's readers were offered a discount. This format change from tefrika to bound volume underlines an economic conscience and a recognition of how the readers were also potential consumers of the book. The Raphael competition demonstrates that there was an area of tension between the loftiness marking the classics debate and the practicalities of actual translation. Raphael was an attempt at combining these 2 considerations, and a close examination of it reveals a series of issues related to late Ottoman print culture, both on an ID level and on an economic one. The fact that the competition faded out opens for new questions. Was it because of lacking interest and response from the readers? Because of economic limitations, censorship, or unreliable translators? The many considerations and prospects involved when translating Raphael and presenting it to the readers suggest that the translated Tefrika did more than simply offer a form to fiction literature. It also functioned as a practical response to ideals about translation, as well as to the requirements of the emerging print economy. In that sense, the translated Tefrika, here exemplified by the both remarkable and representative Raphael translation, demonstrates how literature and the press were intertwined and dynamic fields, mutually influencing each other. Thank you, and I now pass the word on to Hazal.
Thank you, Ingeborg. Following a series of pogroms targeting the Armenians in Adana region in April 1909, Halide Edib, a rising star in the Turkish intelligentsia at the time, wrote a powerful condemnation in the newspaper Tanin. She addressed her Armenian compatriots as victims of the darkest calamity, explicitly depicting her own despair and disgrace of being a member of the party that killed them. Entitled Those Who Died and Those Who Killed, the letter is a lament and witnessing. Adana, she writes, is a graveyard with, quote, thousands of extinguished bloodlines, piles of human bones, and sorrowful mothers writing upon their dead children, end of quote. Grief, mourning, and shame reverberate in the lines. Young Turks, Halide Edib insists, are bound to take revenge for the Armenians and punish the perpetrators, or else an eternal spot of disgrace would remain upon Turkishness. 8 days later, Tanin published an Armenian woman's response. Sepulhi Markaryan, who had read the translation of Halide Edib's letter in the Armenian newspaper Byzantium, thanked her in the name of all Armenian women for joining in and sharing their grief. Women of letters and of pure conscience like Edib had a sacred duty, wrote Markaryan, because their task was to teach ideals of justice and fraternity to the Ottoman community. On May 28, another Armenian woman, Baydzar Torkomyan, responded to Edib in Yeni Gazete. Torkomyan saw Edib's outcry of grief expanding to all Muslim sisters of conscience who felt Armenians' loss in their hearts. Edib's impactful words reminded that those who had fallen into doubt about the fraternity between Turks and Armenians, that they were the children of the same motherland, quote, who grieved with each other's sorrow and brightened with each other's happiness, end of quote. This was an important moment in which witnessing and mourning each other's loss as a collective loss emerged as a possibility among Turkish and Armenian women. But it was very brief. 6 years after the Adana massacres, when the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, emptied out the entire Armenian population in Anatolia by a deportation decree, Halide Edib did not write any public text of condemnation, nor did she bear witness to the genocide of Armenians in any later text. As she became the most recognized woman pioneer of Turkish nationalism, the capacity to witness or mourn for Armenians or any other millet that once shared the Ottoman homeland and constituted the Ottoman community disappeared from her text, as well as the traces of her own outcry of collective loss. In my work, I analyze how the repressed memory of the genocide of Armenians returned to and haunted Halide Edib's novels, as well as other writers in the newly founded republic, in ways that rendered witnessing impossible for Turkish literature. But here, I want to focus on 1909, when witnessing was still a possibility, and think on the meaning of its loss, rather than why it was lost. The discourse of a shared homeland that Edib's, as well as Markaryan and Torkomyan's letters referred to, were the ideals of the constitutional revolution of 1908. When the years-long struggles of Ottoman opposition groups succeeded and the 3 decades-long reign of Abdülhamit II ended, there was a shared hope of a new era beginning for different ethnic and religious groups who had united against Hamid's tyranny. Coexistence as Ottomans, building an Ottoman identity as well as citizenship on the basis of equality, freedom, and establishing fraternal relations among different millets was the constitutional dream. In this context, the Hamilian massacres of 1895 to 1898 against the Armenians in the eastern provinces were widely acknowledged by young Turks as the nightmare of the previous regime, reassuring all that they were never to be repeated again. There are numerous literary examples. The epigraph of a play published only a few months after the revolution, for instance, Mehmet İhsan Bey's Armenian Victims or Devoted Turkish Officer reads, quote, "This book is written to assure and maintain the close fellowship that was settled between Turks and Armenians since time immemorial," end of quote. As well as each other's losses, also recognizing each other's accomplishments as a collective legacy was part of the Becoming Ottomans project. For instance, the Turkish women's journal Demet, which was founded 2 weeks after the revolution, presented leading Armenian women writers such as Zabel Asadur, Sırpuhi Disap, and Zabel Yeseyan in an extensive feature entitled Famous Ottoman Women, while the Armenian and Turkish Women's Friendship Association, that was also founded in 1908, brought women together under a collective organization. In the wake of Balkan Wars, in a short novella, the famous Turkish nationalist Ömer Seyfettin went on to ridicule these attempts by an imaginary cultural society named the Ottoman Mixing Club, Osmanlı Kaynaştırma Cemiyeti. The counter-revolution attempt of April 13th, 31 Mart vakası, was the first blow to the constitutional ideals of Ottomanism. Although the movement was suppressed by the Action Army in a few weeks, by the start of the Adana events, April 1909 became a turning point for the revolutionary promise. At the moment where the first wave of clashes between Turks and Armenians were thought to have simmered down, the second and more devastating wave of massacres started. 20,000 Armenian lives were lost. Edib, Markaryan, and Torkomyan's insistence on collective mourning as a shared experience at this moment can be seen as an attempt to ensure the possibility of coexistence when the constitutional ideals of Ottoman collectivity and fraternity among millets was at stake. The very first sentence of Halide Edip's letter, written in Alexandria, where she had fled after learning that her name was on the blacklist of counter-revolutionary militias, assures that Abdülhamid's regime of tyranny, at least its legacy, is responsible for the massacres against Armenians. The tyranny, which she calls the Hamidian nightmare, is ending, and it catapults its final shards of evil and devastation on the places it passes. This text of lamentation also strategically separates all the parties impacted into their own corners. While begging for forgiveness from the Armenians for being a member of the party that killed, she's also calling on the young Ottoman nation who has Niyazis and Envers in their army to provide the revenge Armenians deserve with their swords. Thus, the letter claims responsibility in the name of Turks, while also carefully separating young Turks from the act of killing. Read in this context, those who died and those who killed is neither the only text written by a Turk that acknowledges killings of Armenians by Muslim Turks, nor is it a deviation from the CUP discourses of the time. Many other texts written immediately after the Adana massacres condemn the Armenians' loss as a collective loss for the entire Ottomans. What distinguishes Halide Edip's letter from other condemnation texts is not the content. Rather, it is the capacity to convey feelings of grief to its readers, and hence open a space for collective mourning. This space in which Armenians' loss is recognized by a Muslim Turkish woman differs from a mere discursive claim to Ottomanism. Halide Edib makes sure her words draw the reader into the realm of the senses by the use of her gender. From the outset, she defines her sorrow as motherly grief. She explains how, quote, her soul aches and mourns with the pain of a mother, end quote, and articulates her, quote, need to share the grief of each and every survivor with tears of her soul, end quote. We see in Markarian's and Torkomian's responses that Halide Edib's employment of gender was the main source of hope for them, because collectives are primarily formed through shared feelings. Adopting the Ottoman ideals discursively was not enough. What could protect the Armenians from any future calamity was Turks' appeal into believing in equality, feeling the fraternity, and tasting freedom through mourning as a collective. Because if loss is shared rather than segmented, fractured, or shunned, then these ideals voiced in the Ottomanist discourse could also be shared and strived for together. Armenian women's gratitude to, but also expectation from Halide were built on a hope that she had the ability to expand these feelings and sensibilities to her community, because she was a woman. This is why, besides being a missed opportunity for Ottoman women, Edib's withdrawal from witnessing in her later texts has implications for feminist struggles of today as well. The reasons behind Halide Edib's changing stance regarding the Armenians is beyond the limits of this paper. But starting with the traumatic loss in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, there seems to be a shift in her focus of the collective that constitutes the Ottomans. Despite taking a critical stance against the deportation decision in CUP circles in 1915, and depicting the destitution of Armenian orphans in her personal correspondence during her much debated supervision in the Aintura orphanage in Beirut in 1917, she chose not to share any comments with the Ottoman public. And after the Ottoman defeat in World War I, Halide Edib's main agenda became assuring the national sovereignty of Turks on Ottoman territory. Even in the few instances where she acknowledged the annihilation of Armenians, she seems more concerned about how this attempt made Turks appear to be a cruel nation in the Western world. After the Allied occupation of Istanbul and Izmir, even that recognition disappeared from her texts. In her memoirs in 1926 and Turkey Faces West in 1930, she withdrew her witnessing to the Adana massacres entirely by claiming that she was not aware of the Armenians' massacres against Turks at the time. The Armenians' annihilation became so intertwined with the threat to national sovereignty and the independence of Turks for Halide Edib that her denial expanded from 1915 back to 1909 to erase all the traces of the possibility of collective mourning. Often, when Halide Edib's denial of the Armenian genocide is discussed, the historical events encircling the 1912 to 1923 period are presented as natural causation, as if there was no other possibility within her historical context. However, what is at stake here is seeing that it was precisely Edib's withdrawal from witnessing that erased any other possibility. What is lost in the formation of the Turkish national narrative, which interdicts witnessing, mourning, and holding space for Armenians' loss, is that there always was another possibility. Halide Edib did not invent this juxtaposition of Armenian suffering in opposition to the Turkish national narrative, which is built on a monolithic Turkish trauma. But her withdrawal reveals something crucial about the nature of this narrative: the need to repress the memory of a shared homeland, coexistence as equal subjects, the shattered dreams of Ottomanism, as if it's a matter of survival. We don't know whether Markaryan or Torkomyan were in Istanbul or in Anatolia in 1915, and whether they survived the genocide or not. But if they did, they must have waited for a word from Halide. Lerna Ekmekçioğlu recently revealed another Armenian woman, Zaruhi Kalemkaryan's open letter to Halide in 1918, in which, referring to her lamenting Tanin letter, Kalemkaryan challenges Halide to witness Armenians' catastrophe in the aftermath of 1915 and 1916. But that recognition was never uttered after the Armenian genocide. And Markaryan, Torkomyan, Kalemkaryan, and other Armenian women were left alone in the space of collective mourning that they were invited to. This must be an important consideration for feminist history writing today, especially for the recent feminist reclamation of Halide in Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. Now we will move on to our discussion. But before then, I would like to remind our audience that we will have a Q&A session. So please feel free to post your questions on the Q&A function. So I leave the floor to Özen, Nergis, Dolcerocca. Thank you very much.
Merve, thank you so much. And I would like to thank Erik, Blackthorne-O'Barr, Ingeborg, Foosestøl, and Hazal Halavut for sharing their work with us today. It was refreshing to see new perspectives on what we term today as Tanzimat literature. And these papers each demonstrated different angles of the literary field in the late Ottoman Empire and partially early Republic during this critical period of cultural reforms, of linguistic renewal, and literary Renaissance movements. These papers bring together anxieties over class, desire, and gender norms, as we've seen in Erik's paper, over linguistic modernization and the booming literary market, as we've seen in Ingeborg's paper, and over imperial identity and local nationalism, as we've seen in Hazal's talk. So all of these themes, these anxieties, they lie at the core of the topic for today's panel, which is politics of literature. I think that three papers shed light to a different aspect of this period, as I said, bringing together literary, political, economic, and urban histories. In the first paper, we learn about the most prolific author of the period, right, Ahmet Mithat Efendi, who at times notoriously explored different genres, themes, and writing practices. That's why Tevfik Fikret called him nothing but a big mouth, yalnız koca bir fem, referring to his obviously excessive appetite, apparently like he loved eating and he was a big guy, but also his writing habits, right? And here in Erik's paper, we encounter a very interesting novel by Ahmet Mithat, which involves cross-dressing, crime, and the Persian other in societal and in linguistic literary terms. On the other side, we learn about the emerging literary market, increasing magazine publication, and a transformation of the literary field through different translation practices. And finally, we discover one of the most important literary figures, Halide Edib's ambivalence at a critical crossroad period between attempts at cosmopolitan imperial reconfigurations and emerging Turkish nationalism. My first observation will be about the period, the chronotope, which we call Tanzimat, in literary historiography, very briefly. As you know, Tanzimat literature evolved under political turmoil, the conflicts between constitutional and absolute monarchy, rising nationalist movements and their repressions, and modernization efforts. For the literary activity at large in the 19th century Ottoman Empire, we can say that it translated, it read literature in pandemonium, in Tanzimat, which we can say epitomized in Mithat's work. We find transgressive literary practices, including disregard for canon and literary standards, the modern ones, that is, multilingual cross-cultural printing and publishing, and challenging notions of authorship and scandalous understanding, what you call scandalous understandings of translation. And it is only recently that scholars have revisited this unique moment in literary history, marked by these convergences, collaborations, intersections, and conflicts between cultures within and outside of the empire. In this panel, the papers revisit the 19th century Ottoman literary field and demonstrate the productive challenges it poses for the field of cultural study, cultural studies, cultural history, for the field of comparative literature, and for the field of translation studies, among others. To start the Q&A session, I would like to pose one or two questions to each of our panelists. And then eventually we will start the Q&A session with questions from the chat board. I think the papers here complement each other, as I said, in capturing a different aspect of this period. So Erik, I think the most interesting aspect of your paper on Durdane Hanım is your attention to eroticism and how it becomes an effect of language, and the repression of non-normative sexual desire sort of comes together with you say it's almost an equivalent to the banishment of the Persianate vocabulary in literary texts of the period. So could you elaborate on this idea of Persian, figuring as this literary, linguistic, the political, and the moral other in late Ottoman literature? And related to that, are there any other authors or works that figure this Persian other from the period? I realize you mentioned Muallim Naci, Ahmet Mithat conflict, and I was recently reading Muallim Naci's Heder, and where he says that the Persian vocabulary, we start forgetting it, but it's the most beautiful thing, and then he starts quoting a sort of ghazals in Persian. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on this other, and whether we can trace this in other works as well. Ingeborg, in your paper, you show that late Ottoman society was a translation culture, and you focus on translated tefrikat. So here, exemplified by these different Raphael translations, and you wonderfully demonstrate how literature and the press were intertwined and they influenced each other. At this point, I'm really curious about two things. The first one is this picture of the literary market based on tefrika, on serialization that you draw here, carries strong parallels to the French and English markets of the 19th century. So in that sense, could we compare, say, the French and the late Ottoman literary fields in this respect? And my second question is, it's about the different practices of translation in the period, which I'm really interested in. And how does these different practices of translation relate to the modern notion of authorship and originality? Whether there were other definitions of authorship and originality. And finally, Hazal, Halide Edib's earlier letter you say that it's different in its capacity to convey feelings of grief to its readers, and hence open a space for collective mourning. You describe this moment as a missed opportunity for Ottoman women. And you also imply that this could also be a missed opportunity for us today, for the feminist struggles today. Could you please elaborate on that? How does Halide Edib's withdrawal from witnessing, as you call it, relevant to today's struggles? What are the implications for her text, for us today? If I could ask Erik, Ingeborg, and Hazal to give us brief answers, hopefully we will have more questions for you in the chat box. And I hand the floor back to you, and thank you all.
Thank you so much. Yeah, these are great questions. Thank you. I guess I'll start since I was first. So I'll start first with the question about other works that have Iranian characters or Iran as a kind of motif. And so there's a sort of very wide spectrum of works that actually, have a kind of Iranian presence within them. Obviously, there was a very sort of long tradition of stories and literature related to the Shahnameh, related to Iran as a kind of fantastical geography. So even in the 1880s, I mean, probably one of the most popular works would be the Ali Aziz Efendi's Muhayyalat, right? Which the first story is very much this kind of fantastical Shahnameh kind of story. And we see that actually in theater at that time, many of the most prominent writers during the late Tanzimat period were also adapting the Shahnameh geography in order to kind of set stories in Iran. But here there was a slight difference in that Iran sort of became an allegory for very localized contemporary political aspects. So Shemseddin Sami's Gave, the Shahnameh story, but it's very much allegorized to talk about young Ottomans and their kind of resistance to tyranny. And Abdul Haq Hamit's Nesteren is also theoretically a Shahnameh story, but it's very much kind of actually adapting French literature and trying to achieve a sense of fantasy by using Iran as a setting. But in addition to these kind of much more sort of I won't say imaginary, but more imaginative sort of, mythical kind of understandings of Iran, there was a accompanying project of anthropological literature, which begins to talk about Iran in a much more ostensibly objective manner. And so just before Dudane Hanım is published in Tercüman Hakikat, Mehmet Emin's travelogue to Central Asia is also published in the same journal, Istanbul'dan Asya'ya Buste'ya Seyahat. And here we have a much more specifically attempting to define what Turkishness is by contrast to Iranianness. And so he goes to Central Asia and tries to uncover what he calls the Ancient Turks, by which he means the Turkmen. And in every respect, their social customs are defined as the positive aspects of a kind of negative Iranianness. So there's this kind of, in this travelogue, similar to Durdane Hanım, we actually have a kind of association between Iran and debauchery, Iran and sort of the bending of gender norms, the kind of illicit desires. And so Durdane Hanım, I think, sort of sits in between these works. It still has the kind of fantastical elements, I think, of the plays and of the Meda stories. But at the same time, I think it's trying to achieve a kind of point about desire, I think, which is much more related to the travelogues. And then to talk about the sort of production of Persian, I think, as a separate language. I think that's really, really interesting because, there's a lot of writing about Ottoman Turkish as a kind of interlanguage and as, thinking about how, for an educated Ottoman intellectual, like the 18th century, I mean, you can very fluidly move between Arabic and Persian and Turkish grammar, vocabulary, and things like this. And I think there's two aspects which really alter the kind of status of Persian itself in multiple ways. The first would be that the change in education systems, which meant that French sort of supplanted Persian as a kind of, a kind of second language you learn or something, or a third language you learn. And what this meant was that Persian vocabulary, I think, became sort of exoticized in a way that hadn't been before. I think Carter Finley has a statistic where he says that tracking the kind of the proficiency in Persian among the Ottoman bureaucracy, by the late 19th century, I mean, it's very low compared to much earlier, whereas French, of course, is vastly increased. So one effect of that is that Persian becomes seen as a kind of much sort of foreign, separate thing, right? And the vocabulary itself comes to be seen as a kind of constituting a foreign language, not part of the Ottoman language. And that has multiple effects. It can be a reaction of purification, which I think we see in Ahmet Mithat, and we see in Ömer Seyfettin. We have exoticization, which I think we see in Moğolun Naci. But I think also with the Sarvet-i Funun writers, we see a lot of very interesting ways about trying to adapt this vocabulary and create something sort of new out of it. So I think, yeah, the rise of a kind of anthropological understanding of Iran, and the new regimes of citizenship and things like that, as well as the change in education systems, kind of produce Persian as a very sort of separate entity, which can be distinct from Turkish itself.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. Very good questions. I'll start with the first one on the serial novel. I think I mentioned very briefly in my paper that the Tefrika was a transnational genre, just uniting readers, not only across communal borders within the Ottoman Empire, but also across national borders. So I do think the developments towards a far-reaching print economy in the late Ottoman Empire do have parallels in Europe, and I think one should also consider the Tefrika a largely both transnational and transcommunal phenomenon. So briefly on the parallels with French developments, the serial novel or the roman feuilleton was a highly popularizing element in the French press as this emerged from the 1830s onwards. I mean, as the serial novel emerged. So it contributed to growing literacy and to the development of some sort of literary taste. Namely a taste then for fictional works with great pace and dramatic structure, so popular literature, and in many cases the serial novel in the French context was even more important than the news and the profile of the newspaper that printed it. So the readers bought the periodical simply to keep pace with the serial novel, which was about to become a more and more complex and specialized genre, sharpened somehow in order to fulfill the reader's expectations and demands. And then an indispensable element to maintain sales numbers. So the serial novel required a lasting will to buy, to read, and to buy again. And I think this element, this exploitative economic element of the serial novel is what spread and gained foothold beyond France and England and across the globe, actually. And in Ottoman lands, in the late Ottoman period, it is manifested by the fact that the development of print capitalism, helped out by the Tefrika, occurred more or less at the same time and with the same authors and works across communal borders and imperial languages, which Etienne Charrière, among others, has been working on. So in many of the millets, then a similar taste and thirst for the very same kind of novels developed, and that I think is that the Tefrika summed up somehow. Then very briefly on your second question on originality and authorship, I will not be able to give you anything else than some preliminary reflections. I think what marked late Ottoman translators and often authors as well was this impressive versatility or polyvalence that Özgür Turesay has called it. That one man or a woman, for that sake, could fill several functions in the written public sphere at once. So he could be a translator, an author, an editor, a journalist at more or less the same time. And this versatility might have gradually been challenged by the growing attention paid to the translator and to his task, as exemplified in the Raphael competition, for example, when they are admired or presented as someone to admire. So the translator then was almost portrayed as an author, as one person creating or recreating another man's work. And in certain cases, this was even reflected in the translated text itself, the freedom or the infidelity marking the translation practices somehow turned the translator into an independent influence. So I think that there was an overlap between the role of the translator and the role of the author, propelled maybe by the changing translation practices somehow, which these practices did somehow permit originality through infidelity. Changing practices of translation, I think, may have had a certain impact on the notion of the author and the notion of originality, also because the role was largely invented anew and invented in ways that could house a new and perhaps a more inclusive or far-reaching way of using text and literature. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingeborg. I'm gonna say a very quick word. I forgot the most important question I wanted to ask, so I have to ask this. Hazal, I forgot to ask you my second question, and I really want to know about this. So I'm sorry. I apologize for the interruption, but something you say something is lost in the formation of the national narrative, Turkish national narrative, which interdicts witnessing, mourning, and holding a space for Armenians' loss. That there was another possibility at this point. How do we trace this transition in literary text? So I want to ask you this question on top of my sort of the Edib's ambivalence's relation to our contemporary struggles. How do we trace this transition in literary texts? Thank you.
Thank you, Nergis. These are both very important questions, and let me start with the missed opportunity, maybe. What I refer to as a missed opportunity through Halide Edib's letter is the possibility to move beyond the imperial subject position and seeing Armenians' loss as a collective loss. So this possibility of creating a collective that could mourn for each other's loss, the possibility of different religious and ethnic identities forming an Ottoman collective was erased from Halide Edib's later texts. And most people, especially in Turkey, most people know Halide through these later texts. I mean, no one really speaks of or remembers these Tanin letters or like the newspaper columns that she wrote. I think it wouldn't be wrong to say that the two fields that Halide's legacy is maintained in today's Turkey is literature and women's movement, women's history, maybe. And in terms of literature, you know, generations of people were introduced to her novels in school years. And especially her nationalist novels written in the 1920s, which also means, I think, generations of people grew up learning Turkish nationalism, learning the denial of the Armenian genocide, racist depictions of Armenians and Greeks as the betrayer nations, or the need to assimilate Kurds through Edib's novels. So I think it's easier to trace Halide's legacy in the field of literature, but in terms of feminist struggles today, it is a little more complicated. We know that starting from the 1980s, feminist movement distanced itself, feminist movement that was born, distanced itself from the Kemalist narratives of history and critically questioned it. So I think on the one hand, this allowed feminists to have a critical stance regarding the Armenian issue, if not genocide, or the Kurdish issue. On the other hand, also as a result of this critical engagement with Kemalist history, Halide started to be reclaimed as a strong woman who challenged men's authority, especially Mustafa Kemal's authority, and that was wronged by Mustafa Kemal. So I don't have really time to go into the details of this dilemma, but here I think what we see is that there's a discursive recognition of what happened to Ottoman Armenians among feminists, which is of course very important considering that the complete denial is still the main reaction in Turkey. But in this discursive recognition of the Armenian genocide or Armenian issue, what is lacking is the recognition of the implicated subjects and subject positions. That's why Halide can enter the picture as a modern heroine without problematizing her role or implicatedness in the institutionalization of denial of the genocide. Or for example, I have written quite a bit about this, the discovery of Zabelyasayan in Turkey in 2005. Again, we see there that the recognition of the Armenian genocide in Turkey among feminists cannot really move beyond feminist nostalgia. So the mechanisms that enabled and maintained the genocide and the denial of it remain unquestioned in this approach, I would say. The imperial subject positions, Turks' implicatedness and responsibility are not questioned. So what was missed as an opportunity, I think, as a possibility after 1908 for Ottoman women, remain unaddressed today and is still being missed. And
just to, if I may, just to intervene, we have 10 minutes left. We can extend a little bit more, but then, if after the discussion, we will have some time for the questions. Just a quick reminder. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be really brief, but that's of course, very complicated question. The how to trace this transition from witnessing to the withdrawal of witnessing. I think the primary thing here is reading literature and history together. But this is a little different from contextualizing literary texts historically, because the text of the Turkish nationalist literature are also writing history. They are making history in a very specific way. Because if you think about it, until the 1950s, the Armenian genocide was either overlooked or discursively denied in Turkish literature. And and in the 50s, the rise of socialist realist novel opened up a space for the writers to distance themselves from the official narratives of the Turkish state. And that's how the deportation of Armenians entered the discursive world of the novel. But the singularity of the Armenian genocide was not really recognized in Turkish literature until the 1990s. That's a very, very long period. But if you focus, for your question, if you focus on the 1915 to 1950 period, I'd say that's the most definitive period for Turkish literature, because the writers who produced in this period actually lived through 1915 and 1916. So the fact that there isn't a single literary text in this period that acknowledges what happened to Ottoman Armenians is very telling in terms of the role of literature as a modern institution in the denial of the genocide. So tracing Armenian genocide in Turkish literature requires, I think, reading and contextualizing what is being erased from the history and from the literature at the same time. So I would say close reading as well as distant reading of these texts, reading the repetitions, reading the lapsus moments, reading what is missing in the text, by historical research about the writer, about the specific location of the events that are taking place. So these are some of the ways to trace the formation of Turkish national narrative in opposition to Armenians' loss. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will have a few questions, so I would like to read them to our speakers. The first question is from Çağdaş Acar. Could Ingeborg repeat later Cenab Şahabettin's comment on Concord and all as opposed to Goethe, Schiller, and etc. Always intrigues me this question of first class versus second class French authors read by the members of Edebiyat-ı Cedide. So what extent is this critique aesthetic, and to what extent is that a political positioning of the later generations?
Yeah, thank you. To what extent is this critique aesthetic, and to what extent is that the political positioning of the later generations? I don't know. I don't think I'm able to answer that question now. But I have pasted the quote in the chat, and also the full reference to the Tercüman Hakikat issue. So it's possible to look it up. But I agree, it's those are intriguing questions. Thank you.
Okay. So, but could you maybe you would like to elaborate a little bit on the the views on the classical writers, and that they found nothing of ourselves kind of perception. Could you give us more on the classics debate and how it connects to your research?
Yeah, I think the question or what becomes evident when you read those texts is that it's hard to understand actually what they mean by classic. What is classic, and how it is supposed to be used. So I think there is quite a lot of inconsistency in that regard, and also partially some arbitrariness, as with the choice of Raphael, for example. How did that become a classic? And they don't really explain it. They label it a classic, and they translate it, and they want it to be read, and they want it to generate interest, but I have not been able to sort of to completely trace the idea of the what a classic is, but what, and they also refer to Islamic classics, you know, so different aspects are included, but I do think there are at least some aesthetic convictions that are revealed in the classics debate and in the choice of Raphael, and especially they become evident when you oppose them to the economic considerations and popular Paprika literature, as I mentioned earlier. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingeborg. And Hazal, in your paper, you mentioned that Turkish national literature is built on a monolithic Turkish trauma that erases Armenians' loss. So, can you elaborate on that through literary examples?
Sure. Thank you. I think we can actually say the literary texts which depict the national struggle, the Turkish literary texts, are actually also trauma texts. That they try to convey a Turkish trauma. But of course, while trying to convey that trauma, they also carry the signs of other traumas that they are erasing. I think it's possible to see this in a lot of novels like Sword of Fire, Yaban, Istanbul. But I think the best example, one of the best examples that I can think of is on how this juxtaposition of Turkish trauma in opposition to Armenian trauma is again in Halide. When we read her literary texts together with her non-literary works, personal correspondence, articles, we see what is being erased very clearly. The example I'm thinking of is her short story. It's a short story called Tanıdığım Çocuklar in Dağa Çıkan Kurt that was published in 1922. It can be considered as an autobiographical short story, but the narrator in the story tells us the story of two kids. One is an Arab, the other is a Turk. It's a story about children's destitution during the war. The narrator tells us how she ran into those kids, one in the street, one was in Istanbul, the other in Lebanon, in very difficult conditions, in extreme poverty, with the devastated look in children's faces. But at one moment in the story, we understand that the narrator is recollecting these moments of an Arab and Turkish kid in Syria, which she names as the period of kids in my life. So when we move outside the literary text, this short story, we know that the kids period in Halide's life is the period when she supervised the Ain Tura orphanage, where there were hundreds of Armenian kids. So it's a very controversial area, as you all know. I'm not going to get into the details of that. But what we see in her literature here, I think, is very important because, for example, in her personal correspondence with Cavit Bey, we know that, she depicted the Armenian orphans' destitution in a very vivid way in her letters. And even in those letters, she said, if she could pay the price of this calamity with her life, she would. But what happens when we come to the literature is that the destitution of Armenian orphans cannot find a place in her literature. But more importantly, they are replaced and erased by the Arab and Turkish kids in the story. So she mentions in the story that she recollects these stories about Arab and Turkish kids in Syria in a period in her life, as she calls the kids period, but she never names that those were Armenian kids. And of course, and the story ends, asking, oh, where are those kids now? So, there are many other traces of what is being erased, repressed in the story, because I think a literary text is always communicates so much more than its discourse and its writer's intentions. And maybe we can say that, in this text too, there's a way for the text to tell us what the writer, what its writer is erasing.
So I'm going to intervene here. We're really running out of time. There is one other question, but I will answer that question myself. Somebody wants your Halide Edib 1918, Natasha Lemos wants your Halide Edib 1918 reference. I would like to remind you that these papers will be published in the Journal of Turkish and Ottoman Studies, and you will have access to them there. Also, the webinar will be accessible to you on YouTube in a couple of days. So you can reach them, but I really encourage you to go and read the papers when they come out in the journal. They collect to a very nice ensemble. We are really out of time, so thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much for your excellent questions. Goodbye, everyone.